Between 1941 and 1945, 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazi regime. A small percentage of Jews survived the Holocaust. Irving Roth is one of those survivors. He recently led a group of students through a Holocaust remembrance tour in Poland.
Well, I'm doing this because it is now almost 65 years since the flames of Auschwitz were extinguished. Yet I want to make sure that the world, not just in the world in general, but specifically individual human beings, students, understand what took place.
Why is Auschwitz, why is the largest extermination camp in Europe actually on this site? And there's one very simple answer. It's a hub. It was a hub. All the trains running from Western Europe going towards Eastern Europe ran through this. The town itself is insignificant in that respect. What's important is that it was a major hub where you could have trains coalescing going from all over Western Europe going on to the east, or from Eastern Europe going on to Western Europe. So this is a place you can concentrate people.
If you look at the fence itself, it's different than it is in Majdanek. It's a concrete structure, and if you look at it, they have those little nipples on them like. Those are insulating stanchions. What they are is insulators. Like you have, if you, in your neighborhood, if you have electric service, of course, you have posts, electric posts or telephone poles, and on them are these huge insulators. They're insulators because the barbed wire itself, look at how close they are to each other. And each one of those carries 5,000 volts. And it's something which is very visceral. One of the things that happens when you have arcing, which you did quite often, particularly when it rained, ozone is created, and there's a particular sound to it and a particular smell to it. And that smell and that sound is still with me.
As we said, this ghetto is going to be established in November of 1940, and it's going to last until May of 1943. It is neither the first nor the last ghetto, because they have to figure out what to do with this huge population, Jewish population, that's now under their control. And here in Warsaw, what's going to happen is, in October of 39, they're going to quickly establish a leadership of the ghetto. The head of it's going to be a guy we mentioned yesterday, Adam Chernikov. Okay? And in October, the civil commander of Warsaw turns to Chernikov and says, within 3 days, you've got to move 150,000 people from one end of the city, 150,000 Jews, to an area that we're setting up as a ghetto. And the Jews freak out, because imagine if you had to get up and go 150,000 people, whatever cities you guys live in, and move 150,000 people today in 3 days. Find a place to live, get your stuff together. And Chernikov turns to the military commander and says to him, I can't do it. He goes, can't do what? He goes, I can't move 150,000 people in 3 days. It's simply not possible. And he says, well, I didn't give that order. So now let's take apart another myth. The Nazis, as organized they were, a lot of things were disorganized. And here you had competition between the civil administration and the military administration in the city of Warsaw. Now the Jews didn't know how to exploit that, or didn't really understand how it worked, so they couldn't exploit it properly. But for that reason, it's going to take another year until this ghetto is established. They take, altogether, push comes to shove, a little less than 500,000 people, because it's not just the Jews of Warsaw, who are slightly less than 400,000, but the Jews in the surrounding areas are also crammed in, all the villages and towns, okay, around Warsaw. The Jews were emptied out and they're forced into the ghetto, and they crammed them into 2.4% of the area of the city. Somebody yesterday asked me what was the area of the ghetto. The area of the ghetto was about 3.5 square kilometers. Okay, that means nothing to you guys, so let's put it in different terms. On average, every room inside the ghetto had between 7 and 9 people living in them. Okay, think about your room at home, okay, that you either do or don't share with your sibling. A lot of you guys don't share with your siblings. And think about having to share it with 6 or 7 other people for 2.5 years. Okay? And let's take that and say, okay, so in an apartment, you may have one toilet, and you may have 50 people on that toilet. And the Nazis are not exactly allowing cleaning materials into the ghetto. And once you're cut off from the outside world, and you're cut off, your ability to keep clean, talking about personal hygiene and general hygiene, breaks down. You're simply not allowed. And you already understand what's going to happen. Okay? The physical conditions the Nazis are going to create here are going to be devastating for any human being. So already just the overcrowding and just the hygienic conditions that are created for the people here, that alone would slowly kill off the population. Yes, ma'am.
At this point, you know, looking back in hindsight, it seems like why don't 150,000 people just refuse to move into the ghetto?
The German army was undefeated for the first 2.5 years of the World War II. They won every battle. They defeated every enemy, well-armed and well-trained. They beat the British in every battle up until 1942. They, in 6 weeks, conquered France. They defeated the Dutch, the Belgians, the Poles, the Danes, the Norwegians, the Greeks. They defeated every single, and may I say, the Soviet Red Army collapsed in 1941, and they carved a huge swath through the Soviet Union. The German army, and this is important to say it, Wehrmacht, the regular army, and the SS army had no compunctions and no difficulty whatsoever of taking their tanks and taking their planes and decimating civilian populations, Jewish or otherwise. Our story here in Poland, we came to tell the story about the Holocaust, okay, the Shoah, what happened to the Jewish people. But you know what? Tens of millions, something like 49 million innocent people were murdered during World War II by the Nazis and their henchmen. You know how many Russians, unarmed Russians, were murdered? You know how many Soviet troops were killed in camps? People who had military training. And so what are these Jews in Warsaw, who have no military training, no arms, going to do with you can't play the Gandhi can't play with Hitler. It doesn't work that way. Gandhi works well only, or Martin Luther King only works well facing a democracy. Facing quote-unquote an adversary who has whose moral and democratic values are ultimately going to kick in and say, no, I can't shoot into a civilian population, kill, like doing mass killings.
The fact that Jews wanted to leave. In fact, by 1940, half the Jews of Germany have left. Why? Because they saw. The problem was that there was no place to go. In 1938 of September, imagine, 1938 September, there's a conference in a place called Evian. There are 36 nations sitting there, looking at the problem of immigration, of refugees. Already in 1938, you're talking about people wanting to leave. Only one country is willing to take up to 70,000 Jews, the Dominican Republic. Here is the world looking at the problem and saying no. And precisely because of that, Adolf Hitler takes the hint. Nobody wants the Jews. In fact, in one of his speeches, he's very clear. He says, look, here is this wonderful country called America, whose population density is 1/10 of ours. They don't want any Jews. Jews wanted to leave. And from a personal perspective, my family in 1939 from Slovakia wanted to leave. And in fact, we applied to the American embassy, got the appropriate papers, and we got a number. Like in a bakery. The difference is in a bakery, it's a half-hour, bedtime 45 minutes. The line that was formed was 6 years long. So not only is the problem of not seeing, the problem is where to go.
By the way, let's talk about the States for 1 second and understand this a little deeper. You need to understand that in World War I, the United States was dragged into a world war where lots of Americans were killed. And at the end of the war, the American ideals, Wilson's ideals, were trampled on. And so Americans in general were, first of all, very pacifistic. They did not want to get involved in another European adventure, number one. Number two, the Great Depression. Guys, in the United States in the 1930s, there was 25% unemployment. In Germany in the 30s, there was 25% unemployment. Look what happened. Look who gets in Germany, and look who gets in, leading the country in America. That's the difference between a democracy like America and a place like Germany. But, in 1938, going back to what Irving's saying, the Evian Conference, which was called by Roosevelt. Roosevelt called for an international conference to deal with the Jewish refugee problem. But Roosevelt, who understood there was a problem, his hands were also tied because you still had very high unemployment, and there was a sense of how can you bring in all these, how are you going to feed, how are you going to employ these refugees? It's going to come at the expense of your average American. And your average American was not happy. They were against this idea, not necessarily because of anti-Semitism. That may have played a part, but it wasn't the only story here. Ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned about the overcrowding and that you had an average between 7 to 9 people per room and sometimes 50 people on one toilet. And you got the idea of the breakdown of the hygiene. The Nazis allowed the Jews to have 8% of nutrition a human being needs to live. 8%. 8%. Guys, you know American history, and you know about slavery in America, right? Okay? The slaves were chattel, meaning they were property, meaning that a slave owner had a vested interest in making sure that his slave was well fed because it was a workhorse for them. It was their property. It was expensive property until they got old and then they can throw them out, right? Here, the Jews who were going to be used as slaves as well, the Nazis gave them 8% of the food a human being needs to survive, meaning that from the get-go, there's more where that came from. We can kill them off this way. And therefore, we know from Adam Chernikov's diary, Adam Chernikov, the head of the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, that 80% of the food that Jews received, ate in the ghetto, came from smuggling.
What I wanted to point out is that you see the condition. There's a life and death struggle on a daily basis. Simultaneously, the community is trying to survive as a community. Now, it's prohibited for people, more than 2 people, to gather together within the ghetto by the Nazis. But a school system is set up. Imagine the juxtaposition. Death, destruction, and everything you see there on one side. And meanwhile, a school system is set up. A number of people put together a editorial staff to run a daily newspaper and to document every single moment of the life of the ghetto, which is not only illegal, but it's punishable by death. So while the inhumanity is being forced upon the Jews, they continue to try and remain human.
If you're starving and there's overcrowding, it means that people are getting sick very quickly. And you have typhus epidemics that are breaking out on a regular basis in the ghetto. And this is one of the things that is going to be killing the Jews en masse. So the hunger and the disease and the overcrowding is going to decimate the Jewish population. At its peak, we have 5,000 people dying per month. We're not talking about gassing, we're not talking about shooting, we're not talking about the final solution, we're not talking about concentration camps, we're talking about the ghetto itself.
You recognize the sinister nature of Nazism. When the death camp of Sobibor, 12 people escaped. They were caught and brought back to the camp, and they were to be executed. Whereupon Stengel, who was the commander, says to these 12 people, he says, "I am very humane. I don't want you to die alone. Here are 600 people. Choose one for each one of you to die together." Now, obviously, they spit in his face. He says, "Okay, I'll tell you what. Since you won't choose one, I will choose 5 for each one of you." Now what do? You choose one and play God, or 5 people are dead. And you would think that the people who volunteer for this kind of stuff were some wild animals. There were farmers and there were doctors. There were teachers and there were lawyers. Ordinary men. And that's the frightening part. Ordinary men, like you and I, perpetrated these crimes, these heinous crimes. because they were taught that I was not a human being. I as an individual and I as a group was a demon. And you hear it long enough, the other person becomes a demon. And that's the ultimate danger of propaganda. That's the ultimate danger of education without morality. It is often said, let's educate with a moral compass. When you lose the compass, because after all, wasn't Germany an educated society? Morality was turned on its head. And as Hitler himself pointed out in one speech he made, the problem with the Jews is that they have a bunch of thou shalls and thou shall nots. Nazism was a pagan religion. You swore allegiance not to God, not to the law, to the Führer. And you did that as a Hitler Youth. If you look at the oath of a Hitler Youth, is to do everything for the Führer, even die.
What I would like you to do is to look at the track and look to your left and right. It's a long distance. It's something like a mile long. Imagine this is the number of trains that used to come here. I was one of the smaller trains probably. We have 4,000 human beings. Imagine for a moment there are 4,000 human beings here. Everything from babies being held on the arm to men on crutches, some being pushed because after all they were crippled, they had no legs or paralyzed. All this humanity is here. Guards standing all over the place at a ready.
We're in a production line here, a factory. The production line of human beings. They go in as human beings, they come out as smoke. And this is running 24 hours a day. And we're right on the production line right now. And the factory is right in front of us of 4 parallel gas chambers and crematoria that are processing the goods and finishing processing over there. So murder's industrialized here. That's how you can have in one place over 1 million human beings murdered.
Now, one of the things you might think that panic would break out. So how come it didn't? Well, of course it didn't, because what they were told that what will take place is some of the people who are older and younger need a little more care, slower pace. And they'll be going and they will find out that men and women will be separated, because the first thing that you need to do is to have a shower. Why do you need a shower? You've been in the train. In my case, like 3 days. But there were trains that came from Saloniki, Greece. Took 2 weeks. After all, you have not had an opportunity to bathe or to, and all kinds of disease can take place. And therefore, you'll get a shower. The facade was there to the limit, the last minute. In fact, when the selection took place and people who are going to die are then, or I shouldn't say die, wrong word, murdered, are get close to the gas chamber, there are a set of steps going down and they go into a room, and in this room there is nothing except for places to put your clothing. Hangers on the wall, hooks. The hooks have numbers on them. Because after all, panic might break out. But no, what do they say? Make sure you remember the number of the hook that you put your clothing on. So that when you come back, a tall person won't take a short person's clothing. Make sure you tie your shoes together in some way, because you don't want a mismatched pair. And as they turn around, what do they see? A sign above a door, bathhouse. And so they walk in. They're given a bar of soap. There are shower heads in the ceiling. All that to ensure that there is no panic. This process was not put together by a bunch of hoodlums. This was well thought out, well prepared, and as Avi pointed out, the technology was used to the best. So here it is. My grandfather, my grandmother, my aunt, my 10-year-old cousin. You see the flames. It's a bathhouse. Of course there is flames. You have to heat the water. They built the gas chamber underground and an elevator at one end to bring the bodies up. There are 4 of these major installations here. Each one of the installations had 15 ovens. This was a major production facility.
From the moment the people are selected, and this is part of the system, those who accompany them are other Jews, are accompanying the people to be murdered. They're known as Sonderkommando, and they're part of the ruse, they're part of the deception, and they walk the Jews being murdered down into the gas chambers, and they're the ones who clear the bodies. So actually the Nazis, from their perspective, it's all clean. They're not part of the story here. It's the Jews doing it to the Jews, as far as the Nazis are concerned. So if there's a hell within the hell, the people who are in maybe the worst place are the Sonderkommando, the Jews who have to go into the gas chambers and take the other Jews out, and sometimes they're moving their parents' or their kids' bodies from there, or their cousins' bodies from there, and they're burning them, disposing of the bodies. And they're part of this whole process.
Yet on occasion, you would have the members of the Sonderkommando who facilitated this thing because they had no choice. They would go among them and would say, tell them you're 18 years old, and walk away, very quietly. You would look at them, 18 years old, I'm 14 years old, why should I? And those lives were saved sometimes. Sometimes he would look at a person and actually speak to him or her. As we were coming down this ramp, he looked at my grandfather and said to him, "What do you do?" Unfortunately, my grandfather did not say something like, "I split logs." He told them he's a pensioner. Who knows? So there were people on occasion could mix in with the crowd as it came in. Jews would try and help.
There's another reason this place is chosen and why it's an added layer of hell on earth. We're located very close to an offshoot of the Vistula River, which in this area turns into a creek. We're actually located in a little valley here, which is a swamp. And so all the time, there's water seepage. And these trenches here have to do with the idea of draining the water out. So in the summertime, it's very hot, but it's very moist. And in the wintertime, it's freezing cold. Also, you have the water here. And you know what it's like. You understand that when it's cold and you're rained on, or when it's wet, it's even colder. It's bone cold. Okay, so this area here, just the physical characteristics of this site already make it a hellish place. In the summertime, filled with mosquitoes. Okay, right now it's very green, it's very nice, but it's very swampy. It's all very moist. And one of the problems they had here, they rejected this site initially as a site to build this extermination camp because of the difficult physical conditions, and then they decided, you know what, maybe it's a good idea, but they had to constantly deal with this question of getting rid of the moisture of the swamps here. And they're actually still existing on the edge of the camp, kind of reservoirs where they drained the water out, where they got rid of the water. You want to add something to that?
Yeah, and in fact, as I go through my life here or existence here, I'll point out that I spend some time, actually most of my time, plowing fields. They were not really fields to start. They were not arable land. A lot of this was just plain ordinary swamp, because of what Avi points out to you. So he drained the swamps and actually created arable land by breaking out the clumps, by plowing with horses. It was muddy. Mostly muddy. When it rained, it was muddy. Because remember that every morning, every night, you have people in formation between the barracks. You have people coming and going. This is like cultivated land. How many people traipse around? And just imagine in this area, 100,000 people traipsing around. And sometimes people would bend down and pick something to eat, by the way. Like clove is fairly decent nourishment. There was no clove.
Just going back to the check cam thing, why, amidst all this atrocity, would the Nazis even begin to care what the Red Cross thinks?
That's a very important aspect. The Nazis were very sensitive to propaganda. They knew how to use it, but they also knew that the world is of consequence. In fact, when we talked about a few days ago, Avi pointed out that they wanted to make sure that the world knows everything's just okay. Like the whole idea of terrorism. But did they care? They were very sensitive to that. In fact, it was possible to pressure them. Remember, we talked about the fact that they were using, quote, euthanasia to get rid of Nazi Germans, perfectly pure Germans, and they murder them. When the church finds out, there is a clamor, and they stop. This is what the latrine is like. This, my friends, you see the bathroom. On both sides there was a trough, a pipe, and spigots. That is the facility in Birkenau, Auschwitz, Majdanek, Buchenwald, both concentration camps and death camps, which were large for thousands of people. Buchenwald, for instance, was originally built for 5,000. By the time I arrived, there were 60,000 people there. This is the sanitation system. I would just like to point out a couple of things here. One of them, if you see right here behind Avi, you're looking at the heating system. This is what provided heat. This is a damp, cold, miserable part of the country. This is, just looking at it, something on the order, the width of this thing is on the order of a king-size bed. 10 women were often inside in this space.
And there was an underground in Auschwitz. There was one revolt in Auschwitz. It was done by Jews. And it was done by the Sonderkommando. It was done by members of the Sonderkommando. Again, those groups of Jews who were part of the system. Okay? It was done towards the end. And basically, there were women, Jewish women, who were working in the factories. They managed to get their hands on explosives. They smuggled it to the men. And the men succeeded in blowing up an entire crematorium and putting it out of commission. They were all uncovered. The three or four women, I don't remember, 3 or 4 women were all hanged publicly. Okay, all the men were captured. All these Jews who did this were killed.
I sort of saw it, because I was working out in the field, and this explosion takes place, and you can see smoke, and then you saw people running, actually, and behind them are motorcycles, and they catch them, and didn't bother catching them, they shot most of them. In some ways, I always think of the person who was responsible for getting the explosives. She worked in Buna. Remember, Buna is a factory, a chemical factory, and therefore chemicals are used as explosives. And it took them many, many months to get sufficient explosives. Because remember, you see the crematorium, this is not a thatched roof hut. This is a concrete building. So you needed explosive. The last woman to be executed, her name is Rosa Robota. Rosa Robota was executed like the first week in January of 1945. The camp was evacuated on the 18th of January. To the very last moment, murder was being committed. The war was over on the 8th of May. On the 7th of May, they were still murdering people. That's, again, you're looking for logic. This is what Avi was talking about, these little bunkers like. See what they are? They're facing this way, there's a machine gun there, and brick over it, and of course green, so from the air you can't see it. But that was part of the thing, and you have quite a few of these. It's always the issue is make sure that no one can escape. There was no way out except through the chimneys. And being in the hospital, it's weird that you would have a hospital in this place. Millions of people are murdered. You have a hospital for prisoners. And both of us obviously were running very high temperature, contagious, so they put us into the hospital. And after a couple of 3 days, we got better. And you get the same food, but you don't have to do anything. And one day, about the fourth day, the person in charge of the block, actually the secretary, comes over and he says, you, out. I said, could we stay here another day? He says, no, I want you out right now. Well, out is out. So we leave, and the reason he told us to get out, because that afternoon, there was a selection in the hospital. If I would have stayed there, I would not be alive. And the reason he told us to do that, because a person from my town in Slovakia, who was shipped to Auschwitz in 1942, his name is Bumi Gittelman, was here for 3 years. And when we came, I recognized him, and he was quite helpful. He knew when we were in the hospital. He knew there's going to be a selection, made sure that we're out of there. To survive, among other things, somebody, someplace along the way, had to help.
Like your cousin.
Sometimes you had to be ignored. Because if you were in the way, somebody's liable to shoot you or shove you over, and suddenly you're in the gas chamber. So they needed help, but the one thing you needed, which was absolutely necessary to survive, not sufficient, but absolutely necessary, you could not give up. The moment you gave up, you became something called a Muslim. What it really means is that you became skinny, lethargic, didn't care, and once that happened, you were gone. So it was absolutely necessary to want to live. Not sufficient, unfortunately, but absolutely necessary. One of the things you needed to survive, and that's the only thing I can call it, miracles. As I often tell people, I don't necessarily believe in them, I just depend on them. But 11 o'clock in the morning, a runner, a messenger comes, and the couple says, Andras Roth and Irving Roth, come out. And there is a messenger to take us back to the camp. Where am I going? Well, he said that the commandant of Auschwitz I wants to see you. I came to Auschwitz a few days earlier. How does anyone know? The rest of the group said goodbye. And the commandant wants to see you. You don't continue living generally. So you can imagine going to the commandant's office, to that building right outside, and my brother and I go in and escorted into a room, and we're waiting. There's no one there, just a huge desk. Behind the desk, the picture of Adolf Hitler and a conference table. And a few minutes later, another person comes in, my cousin Gershon. I say to him, his name was Gabi at the time, I say, Gabi, do you know why we're here? He says, no idea. So you can imagine three of us, all Roth, called to the commander of this huge 17,000 or 20,000 by then, 25,000 people facility, knows to three kids who arrived a few days earlier. Can't be. Eventually the commander comes in, whose name I can't pronounce, it's about this long. And he sits down behind his desk, but before he sits down, he takes off his belt, his gun, he puts it on the desk. By this time, I have aged 20 years and turned gray. And turns to my cousin, Gabi, and says, where do you work? He says, I work with horses. He was working with horses. There was a special unit where there were 10 stables, horses which worked in the field, horses which were pregnant mares, and another place where there were horses, there were the riding horses for the SS. And he tells him that he works, and he says to him, you like to work? He says, no, I want a better job, right? So he says, jawohl, of course. And he says, how's the food? He says, excellent. And a few more words like that, and he says to us, dismissed. You go back to work, he tells my cousin, and you go into block 3, I believe, or 13, one of the two, because I was in both. And you have the afternoon off. We look at each other like, what in heaven's name was that all about? I mean, well, it turns out I did not know it till the following Sunday, because I found out that my cousin, who was here in 1942, was a secretary to the present commander. And when we arrived and were selected to live and transferred to Auschwitz, she saw the manifest. She sent him a note, give my cousins a good job. If you think that's not weird, nothing is. Working with horses had advantages. One, of course, a very major advantage is the fact that the horses got fed. One of the things they got fed is sugar beets. There's a word for that. It's not called stealing. It's called organizing. Now, the problem is if you eat too many raw sugar beets, you get the runs, and that's not a good thing in Auschwitz. However, if you cook them or bake them or broil them, it's perfectly wonderful. So how do you do that? What you do is you organize not one, but 2 sugar beets. And being that we're working with horses, we had a blacksmith who was a prisoner. So you steal 2, organize 2, you run over there, you give it to the blacksmith, he bakes both of them, he gives you 1, and he keeps 1. This was not a virtual simulation. This was not a reproduction. These doors on the 5 crematoria saw the dead bodies being burned. The manifolds in the back of it provided the air necessary for a quick and efficient way to burn the bodies. The tons of ashes behind us, they are the people. They are the individuals, whether they be tall or short, young or old, who cry out to us. Let this ash, let these doors, this manifold, the witness, the physical witness, tell you to not forget, and tell your children about it.
When I was standing there on the ramp over there, where the trains were unloaded, the boxcars were unloaded, and the prisoners helped other people get off the trains. I thought of my own family, my brother, my mom, my dad, my grandparents being taken off the train too, and being examined to see if they were too old, too sick to keep living or not.
History books can't teach this. The internet can't teach this. Pictures, as horrifying as they are, they can't teach this because you're here and it's just real.
Well, coming here, I was heavy, came in with a heavy heart, and leaving here, I leave with an even greater burden, I feel like. And that is to simply tell the story about what happened here, to never let it happen again.